There is no pleasure in the pathless woods. There is a rapture on the lonely shore. There is society where none intrudes, by the deep sea and music in its roar. I love not man less, but nature more. Lord Byron, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, 1812 to 1818. When the earth has become a wasteland, and 10% of the population have survived, and now reside on another more idyllic planet with no disease or poverty, a touch of jealousy might be justified. But now I know for sure that worlds within worlds exist, lost worlds as yet uncharted, and Cockgrave Wood is one, of a kind. Nobody is clamouring to get there, and those already there seldom leave. Past the impassable ash mountains of Phantom Valley, from where only the keen-eyed can see the soul-warming lights of a holy city which so enrich the lives of normal people and do nothing to lift the hearts of others. Through crystal stalactite grottos and winding freshwater streams, on ground won by its trash-talking inhabitants in bare-handed fights, is a ghostly place that shines in the night with an unearthly glow, as though powered by some fiendish machinery. The local legend has it that the waters there flow from an ancient source deep within the earth and are impregnated with the dark magic of another age, a time older than towns, older even than forests themselves, and that one single warming draught of moonshine made from these waters can leave its poison inside a man's mind for evermore. The folk here spend their days in human shape, and their nights bathed in shadows that form something entirely different, reminders to the New World of the powers of the wilder era. Their place is an area of nature and disastrous nurture, an amalgam that the locals call a family fusion. With its whispering trees and bushes all around, it's the place where I learned to hold my breath whilst walking a loose rope. And how clear is hindsight? Always through cut crystal. I should never have gone. The Finnegans were all taught from an early age that little leaks sink ships, and keep their lips as tight as the tarred sheets that cover the roof timbers of their twisted shack. There are, of course, many sick jokes that circulate the holy city, none of which work. The state of excitement at the prospect of finding the place kept me marching for some time. Eventually I saw a pass opening out on the east side of the hills. There were dark rolling clouds overhead, and in the air the heavy oppressive sense of thunder. The mountain rage had separated into two atmospheres. I had gone into the thunderous one. I lifted the collider from my pocket to look at the time, but the moon defeated the ambient light in the windows. When I cloaked the display with my jacket, the display said I'd slipped back 2 centuries. With every new tree passed, and at every crunching footstep, I expected to see the glare of candlelight through the darkness, but everything was black. Then a dog began to howl somewhere down the valley, a long, anguished wailing, as if from fear. The sound was taken up by another dog, and then another, and on through the gloom of the early evening. At the first howl I felt myself strain, but spoke briskly to myself, mocked myself out of the fear, and shivered, cold sweating, as though having run from a sudden fright. Then, far off in the distance, from the mountains on each side of me, began a louder and more vivid howling, that of Wawats. Soon I was hemmed in by trees and foliage, which in places arched right over me, and I had to pass through them like a tunnel. Then in a moment, grand glowering rocks guarded me boldly on either side. Whirls of green malachite and pillars of garnet towered over me, and, although I was in shelter, I could hear the rising wind as it moaned and whistled through the rocks, and the branches of the trees that went crashing together as I moved off at a greater pace into a fine rain that grew warmer and warmer through my clothes. The keen wind still carried the howling of the dogs, though this grew fainter the further I went on my way. The crying of the wowots just sounded nearer and nearer, as though they were closing around me from all quarters. I was filled with dread, and the wildlife seemed to share my fear. I was caught off guard by the brindle blur of panic from a wild hog on its final journey, wrong-footed by a wowot. When I saw the quivering light through the trees, I was almost relieved to see that it was the chapel. The faint yellow flame didn't light any of the ground around me, just the silhouette of ravens up in the rafters of a tree. Through the darkness, I watched a green light shining through the birds' eyes as they stood, startled, quiet of their usual evening chatter. As the effect was only momentary, I took it that my eyes had deceived me, straining through the dusk. And then for a time there was no flame, and I moved onwards through the shade, with the howling of the creatures all around me, as though they were following in a moving circle, growing so much closer that I didn't know what to do for the best. My thoughts turned to a haze. One of the moons went sailing through the brown clouds, and by its light I saw around me a ring of creatures, with long sinewy limbs, shaggy hair, and lolling blue tongues lapping around sharp white teeth. They looked so much more raw and hungry in the grim silence that gripped me that I became paralysed with fear. The creatures began to howl, and I was for a time forced to remain within a living ring of terror, growling me to a standstill. A heavy cloud passed across the face of the moon, and the creatures fell back into the darkness of the forest. There was definitely something too rugged in Father Finnegan's face, something too cold and seldom lit by a smile. Is it possible to be unashamedly forwards while so reserved in sentiment, so inverted in belief and conviction? I would never have thought him to be a priest. Even at chapel meetings, whilst agreeable, something eminently non-human flared from his eye, something that never found its way into his talk. But it spoke all right. It spoke not only in the silent symbols of his afternoon sermon face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. He was abstinent in some respects, drank cheap whisky when he was alone, to crush the taste for single malts, he said. Although he disliked family movies and had not owned a television for 20 years, he had an approved tolerance for children, often pondering almost with envy at the high pressure of spirits involved in their playfulness, and, in the most part, inclined to take part rather than reprove their kiddie games. In this character, it was frequently his situation to be the last moral supporter and charity in the lives of down-going families, and to such as these, so long as they came about his chapel, he never marked a shade of change in the catholicity of his nature. He made the most of his friendly circle, cut from the pages of the good book, because that was the preacher's way. His congregation were those of his own blood, those befriended the easiest, and random street derelicts who were collected up into his mobile church on the lanes. His affections, like tumbleweed, turned with time and implied no affinity with the subject. And so the ties that bound him to Rhonda, a widow whose husband had long since disappeared, was the source of whispers for some of the congregation, and what these two saw in each other, or what had kindled a shared interest, had been somewhat of a mystery. She bore in her every feature the marks of prolonged negligence, the gloomy eyes, the deathly pallor, the chain-smoker's fingers, and it was reported by those who encountered her on her rare trips to town that she said nothing, looked singularly comatose, and would cross the road at the sight of a lawman. When I first saw him through the bracken, Father Finnegan was sitting on the excuse for a veranda, his short lungs and florid cheeks huffing and puffing hot rocks over bare fingers, picking out a magical acoustic rumination of loneliness and loss on a dog-scratched guitar. I was tuned into something illicit and extraordinary. Turning away would mean feeling the same sense of loss you might experience if you were to lose transmission during a macabre picture show. I was on tenterhooks, My mind was made up and my mouth was open, catching mosquitoes that flew up from the stagnant rock pool at my feet. Worms came out of cocoons, and lush green balls of gaseous slime hung from the trees. Strange glowing fruit, almost edible pears, were ripe for picking. My ears, eyes and body, my very spirit possessed by the broken chords of music rising from the grey timbers. I put my head down and trudged through a toxic rain that tapped at the leaves and ran down the crevice behind my St. Christopher. It set the collider flashing twice, from green and back to red. Like all closet degenerate gamblers who can't resist the temptation to keep rolling the dice, I took a step closer. When a branch cracked, the music stopped. The father's eyes turned into black traffic lights of confusion. With slaps and terror flicks, I cleared my crawling neck of insects. The music and their sombre departure, another missed signal to walk away. When he looked up, he didn't see me. He just carried on plucking at the strings with long, dirty nails. It was when the two men arrived and broke out a brace of deer to butcher that I felt the first stirring of emotional displacement. "These two here are for us," one of them said to the women who were gathering around the truck. "Is the father to have anything tonight?" one of the women asked, with a low laugh as she pointed to the old skin bag which had been thrown upon the grass, a bag which writhed and wriggled as though there was some living thing within it. When he answered with a nod of his head, one of the women jumped forward and opened it, and if my ears did not deceive me, there was a gasp and a low moan, as of a half-smothered child. The women closed round whilst I was aghast with horror. There was a scream from the fire and I looked away. When I looked back, the women had disappeared, having taken the dreadful bag with them. There was some distance between the truck and the chapel, and they simply seemed to have faded into the shadows that enveloped the place and passed in through a low window opening. All I saw for a moment before were two shadowy forms, and they were gone. I carried on sketching in complete silence, and a hunger came as they carved steaming chunks of flesh and passed around tins of brandy and chicory, closing each sentence with a "fuck yeah," "woohoo," rutting, tin-tapping away like barnyard animals, treating their behaviour like a national religion beyond criticism. I plucked some confidence from the fact that I was dressed in dark clothes. Bright colours would have attracted their attention, a fashion poppet dolly to a pack of dogs who were coming up wired by a pyre with an absurd lust for life, slicing the air with enthusiastic declarations of thanks and praise to the group of kids that danced with them. Yes, to my astonishment, I saw a number of what I thought to be very small children, about a dozen in number, who all possessed the same round faces, sallow complexion, and long bedraggled hair. I felt that I was perhaps witness to some kind of ritual cleansing of a district and its rustic dwelling by a small tribe of primitive people, all dressed in little gaily coloured short skirts, their legs being bare, their hands joined, and all held up as they merrily danced around in a perfect circle to a fire which was breaking and cracking, while I was completely absorbed by the glowing light which had appeared above them and was changing colour with hypnotic effect. It's difficult to describe my bewilderment at this juncture. I suppose, looking back, thrill could be added to it, that perhaps these hidden people still lived on and might one day be rediscovered. There was a child bound with torn blankets, and a tall man dressed in a trench coat and jackboots who strolled over to leave an unwanted kiss on the face of the girl and collect a warming jug from the fire. He drank, spat, and walked to the shack. It was as though a circus of dysfunctional people had set up camp with a mangy parrot that clearly only had one word, which it screeched when things went wrong. The others sat around drinking beer, doing nothing, laying flat on the ground with a weird confidence growing inside of them, swinging between innocence and primal terror, above a tableau that brought bizarre to my quaking leg. The organist took a few more experimental stabs at the keys. The sound echoed through the valley. The player paused and then started playing again, a strange little piece. And slowly, as the sun went down, something marked by the disorder of spiky flourishes kept me from becoming too comfortable, and yet still a beautiful melody was teased into me. I didn't recognize the song, The Lost One. The female voice sang of a baby born in a cornfield that had to be given away. Paleobiologists write them off as animals for their opprobrious behaviour. There is no known cure, they say. It was printed in the newspaper, and no one can help the psychopathic. That affliction is like the diamonds. It's forever. Inherent damage to the orbital cortex, affecting empathy coupled with abuse at an early age, they say. I still don't know what it was that caused me to wander there. Perhaps I just wanted to see it for myself, scribble a portrait of these strange people in a book, but I met my match in my intended quarry. My fingers froze with fear, and the edge was soon knocked off my curiosity. Brodie Finnegan looked at me with the 1,000-mile gaze of a tripping medicine man, looked right through me. The mouthful he took from the enamel cup spilt out over his lip, but what he did swallow seemed to get him to a more familiar place, mind-wise. He mumbled his way to the grindstone, red eyes caught afire by the lysergic volcanoes exploding behind his beetle brow. The woods came over quiet, and the music struck up again, a long flowing chorus which they all sang together over a slow easy beat, and I discovered a strange guitar sound that was vaguely Indian. Through fingertips, trembling, rested on the bark of a redwood tree. Spine chilled by an organic masterpiece rumbling darkly in a reverie of disturbance, blended discordially with the hypnotic anticipation that was all around me, and rising, the thought that something was on the rise, something was about to happen. Through all the damp and smoking oak, there came the ringing of steel being fashioned against the motion of a grindstone, and a finger-tip steeped in border water playing around the lip of a glass, its presence keen and unsettling, loitering on all of my corners, circling the enamel on my teeth, and piercing my hallows like a bicycle bell through an icy morning. I pulled up the courage to grab my book from my bag and finish the sketch of the hut where they were all living in the epic battle of infidelity, lack of cooperation with the authorities, and other issues. A branch cracked through the bushes and into my consciousness. Brodie Finnegan was exploding in a fury, dumping a rooty blonde's clothes and shoes out onto the wood shavings, screaming curses and bloody murder. As the laundry and blackened stilettos flew, he shouted that he really preferred women from the backside anyhow, and that's what Blondie was pissed off about. She snatched his shirt and with a piece of burnt wood wrote "faggot" on the back. Both shirt and pen were tossed into the long grass. As Brodie stood back with arms folded to enjoy the tantrum, she began to cut up a bunch of his T-shirts with a knife and left for town. They seemed perfect for each other. He rolled a cigarette and burned a hole in his dungarees, cut the leg off and removed what was left of the denim, threw it to the ground, pulled a cork from a bottle with his teeth, and lay flat out, taking regular swigs as a starry night turned above him. A girl with a pierced nose expertly filleted his brother, spat him out on the ground. He led a German shepherd up to her hips, and she held the dog's mouth between her legs. She encouraged copulation in various positions while the groups chanted, "Fuck her! Fuck her!" Brodie stood up, took a long boozy pee, and, screaming verses and curses into the wet soil, passed out. When he came round, he set fire to the alcohol on his long johns with a Zippo, and soon realised that he couldn't put out the flames before they burnt his flesh. From the waist down, Brother Gideon was flat-footed, with the sort of legs that looked as though they couldn't carry a postman on a daily round. From the waist up he was a heavy-weight wrestler, with ropes of muscle rippling across his back, biceps like 2 grapefruits, and Panavision shoulders. But all men keep secrets, some more complex than others. And there are those that dress in elaborate latex bodysuits and masks and strive to become the ideal woman, with no fear of scorn or ridicule, living a very open life as a living doll. Some live in normal streets, do normal jobs, and have normal families. They usually keep their most prized possessions hidden away, but up in the woods anyone can be a masker. Gideon had added hair to make his penetrable cherry popper vagina more real. He spent every spare moment of the last 5 years becoming giddy, and seeing his feminine latex skin, complete with its pouch kit, just blew my hair away. Giddy is part of a group that call themselves the Vanilla People, a secret gathering of maskers who have a don't ask, don't tell relationship with each other. He oiled the firing mechanism of a handgun while the rascals were being turned red by the heat of the burning logs. Why do we have these family ties to our parents? Just 2 cells that came together in a whirlpool galaxy, 2 in 10 billion. I got the feeling it was going to be a while before I got away, until I got anywhere near to a Kodachrome picture of a perfect family day. During the cataclysmic raga and clavichord noise that followed, Brodie got himself caught up in a full-blown episode of manic percussive kicks and fucks like a frenzied beatbox. The night was coming on and the moon was in full Scorpio. Moments passed and, peaking on a cocktail of hallucinogens, Brodie became a human fly, vaulting over chopped logs that surrounded the camp, breaking through the bushes and landed right next to me. He fell down and took off his boots while I remained perfectly still and unnoticed. He lit a joint, smoked it halfway, sucking the burnt weed deep into his lungs before jumping back into the camp to grab a copper fire extinguisher and let fly again, soaking everyone in the group with stagnant water. Even the clavichord player was given a drenching through the hut's window opening. Then he became very emotionally moved, wandering tearful and shouting to the group, "Does anyone understand me?" No one answered. They just carried on in their own distant way, probably wondering how they could continue gaining the ursine strength and courage that would overwhelm their many enemies, whilst I turned an ear away from the winds that moaned down from the mountains to remind us not to go too far from humanity and how easy we find ourselves lost. As the clearing grew very dark, the grim pages of a catalogue continued turning, calling up the complex layers of nature, becoming something way too complex, even for a digital tramp like me to understand. Animalistic practices, occult incest, and a form of bestiality that they call zoomozygosity, further fueled by what lies underground, extraordinary formations that issue minerals which have been deposited over millions of years and now spew out through the high-pressure spouts of a geyser, and more recently, hastily drilled boreholes. Wind had whipped up the exposed half of the camp, and a boiling mist from the green slime was permeating the air, a total contrast to the sun-scorched desert that covers the rest of Etruria. Bathed in the cool, sobering glow of moonlit calm were children's toys that lay silent around the fire, their cheap plastic limbs snapped, their batteries dead, reduced to empty vessels filled with guilt. As I took another stupid step forwards, I could see that the dolls' faces appeared to be scrubbed fresh, conscience cleaned. How I wanted to tell you one tale of cheer, an adventure to warm the very cockles of your heart. But with life flowing back into my fingers, I took a hold of a wet branch and hauled myself even closer through the bush, and, emerging right back into the centre of disbelief, my thoughts to make off back to the city drained away, my spirit broken like the trampled twigs around me, my limbs now weeping sweat into my sleeves. There was no middle ground here, only the quicksand, and the harder I tried to free my feet, the harder it became. And oh, the sinking into that good-spirited mess of meat cooking over the fire, the run to the hills, Alleluia to the Almighty, miles removed from the normal. Are not faiths built on scripture more receptive to the moral? He started out a complete illiterate, a drug-dealing father of 22, by 44. When he did talk, he would insist he was the best father in the world, making all kinds of sincere boasts, despite admitting 7 of his children didn't even know that he was their father, which didn't much matter since he couldn't remember their names anyway. Having been exposed by one member of his flock for using hard drugs, he was far from remorseful. Said that he simply preferred the sanctity of Cotgrave Woods to further raise his brood, born by 11 different women. They all try to villainize me, but they know that I love the king, and I ensure that all my kids are fed, watered, and educated in the ways of the Lord. All except for Brodie, who was jailed for a knife-point robbery. Since hitting the underground main vein, Father Finnegan, known to his runners as the Crystal Methodist, cures his own in a vat out back. He skulks from room to room, tasting his saline lips and dips under the crucifix that hangs over the doorway in a state of freefall, high as a kite at 76. Closing the organ lid, he cups his hand around the naked flame of a wax taper and feeds it to the candelabra that rested upon it. All his sins have been committed when dark spirits meet with the physical world, and now he's chasing the melt and flow of another collision of his chosen elements, distilled from a rich lode of green crystal, which he eyes through a glass before chasing it across a gully of tin foil. The window at which I stood was tall and deep, timber-clad, and though weather-worn, it was still complete, although evidently it had been many a year since the frame had been there. I was looking now through the back window of the shack, close enough to touch the floorboards inside. Caught in a moment where I should have been sketching again, my eyes widened, my fingers faltered, and the pencil shivered across the paper in an attempt to capture an image of the father through the window of the room next door. I stopped for a moment, took a deep breath, cleared my mind of the soiled messages, and tried to return to what was normal, a white page. Everywhere I looked moved me. The limbs and digits of a bat all enclosed in one huge membrane flying above my head. Even the taste in my mouth was of the hills. The rascals continued to dance with the children around soil-splashed rocks and the steaming, seething meat over flame as the tempo of the music increased in time with their circling of the fire. According to the news reports, Father Finnegan doesn't even bother to pretend that he isn't using. Instead, he assumes a mystical "take me as I am" or "go away" kind of attitude, with a confusion of sadness and defiance as both tragic and pathetic at the same time. He didn't want anyone trying to pull him back from the brink of the hole that he seemed intent on digging for himself and his flock, which, when all said and done, belonged to him. Looking under one of the many plastic sheets that were holding the place together, I could see right through to the adjoining chapel, all dark and gloomy, lit only by the candles. The place was hooked up to a generator, but the solid fuel box lay empty on its side. All of the walkways were leading to the one central room where the floor was littered with modern rugs woven with abstract shapes. Half-empty water bottles stood on a table next to a portable stereo. A handful of incense sticks were pressed into a rotting pineapple and burned freely in the air. I was looking right through the place, out over a weed-infested yard, enclosed by high trees and a roughly built red brick wall, with drilling equipment strewn around everywhere. And every day they drill, because what the rocks are producing here is crystals that flirt with the laws of chemistry, crystals with five-fold symmetry, like that of a pentagon that goes against all crystallographic rules. In other words, perfectly periodic, green snowflakes from hell. Clouds blew across the bright moons, and the shack was full of shadows. Echoes of the unknown, gone forever lives that seemed to reverberate between the grimy wooden walls of the chapel and the polythene sheets that gave the whole shack the appearance of an ill-wrapped wax parcel of something noxious. I can remember that feeling of madness as I squeezed myself through the torn sheet of sacking, my face caught up in a cobweb, and then moving towards a darkened hall with the music coming closer. There were no people inside, not that I could see, just me, with the father next door and the shadows that were thrown down by the candles, dancing wildly around the hidden corners in a silent ghostly pantomime. I don't know if the cheap pictures on the wall had any allegorical meaning. A shepherd on a windswept ridge leading his sheep with a flashlight, a false widow spider, and a whole butterfly collection caught upon her web, just posters from an art shop. Knowing full well that there was to be no holy or beautiful light of love to shine down on me through the cracks in those battered old timbers, I pressed on in the hope that Mother Nature might protect and guide me through this playpen of the unnatural. I could see right through to Father Finnegan now, see his high-flown eyes at the top of the clock. He was sucking up on the green smoke through a glass tube, drawing it off the top of a spur of freshly cooked crystal that bubbled in foil over the candle flame. A white light spread over him, crept across him, seemed to warm every cell in his body. When he moved out of sight, I moved closer to the door, peered around it, and saw that he was slumped in a chair, totally sledge-hammered, drifting in and out of consciousness, luxuriating in the warm holy waters of the high. After a few moments he began to come down. Maybe he felt guilty, I don't know, but he became bad-tempered, kicking his way around the wooden floorboards, shouting back towards the group outside. "Look, for God's sakes, it's only one time. I'm not going to go back into it on a regular basis, am I? That would be really careless, and anyways, you're not exactly in a position to be preaching." The betrayal of the innocent. One of the young ones who looked 16 going on 60, wrapped in bandages, for all the world like she had been under the knife to erase the effects of some kind of genetic disorder, gift-wrapped in an arm piece and leg brace, blessed and cursed with the skeletal face of a monkey, and, her breathing getting worse, like a walk to the park might be a life-ending event, and the rascals encouraging her to dance with them around fissile rocks and the puddles of mud, almost as though they were preparing her for an early grave. More trucks arrived, and more folks were greeted with empty talk. Never in my most free-thinking hopscotch of daydreams could I have imagined such a tawdry playground. They were all dotted around the fire, clicking heels on deck chairs, waiting to pay him a visit, like kids waiting for Santa. It was the oddest sight to behold, all of these pale, degenerate people sitting amongst trees, casually enjoying the music, the roasting meat, and the milky moonlight, impatiently counting the minutes until it was their turn to meet with his hallowed presence inside the chapel. And Father Finnegan going around them all in turn, offering them crumbs of broken bread, the leader of a cult where there are a group of doe-eyed passive partners, and him, and through the powers of secret hypnosis, love-bombing, and a heavy shower of affection, he takes them to a place where the love of pure love and nature pales into a grey place, becomes a mechanical expression of something meaningless, a relationship where the central figure exerts control by wielding what some might call invisible handcuffs. A youth who'd been driving one of the trucks didn't appear to be hanging around. He spun his truck in the wet mud and shouted at Brodie Finnegan from the open window as he made for the track. "So why is it that all these people walk around as though they're in a dream?" Brodie appeared to hesitate, and then, as if upon a sideshow stage, he paced around the area and over to the truck to say his piece, with malice in his eyes. "You listen to me. We're just a group of people who live a different lifestyle. The Lord don't hurt no one. Everyone's consensual here." The youth skidded off onto the track and was gone. At first it seemed that he was using some kind of psychological technique to keep them all there. No one can be in a dream like that 24 hours a day unless they were on something synthetic or some substance with a mind of its own. Grown-ups and young ones, all players in an incestuous tragedy, adept at keeping the terrible secret to themselves through recent years and for generations before that. Or so it was, until concerns about the unwashed state and the slow learning abilities and constant rocking and chanting of some of the youngsters when they occasionally turned up at school. Inside the chapel I ran my hand along a dusty shelf and a religious book fell into my arms. As I turned its yellowing pages, I discovered that it was anything but holy, and offered instead paragraph upon paragraph of what I could only describe as shocking perspectives on childhood sexuality, integrational sex, and the social oppression of young people. This book, the nemesis of youth, with its secret codes used to initiate sex and the signal displayed to elude justice, exploded through my every moral fibre, and I reasoned that it must be the group's idea of a justification for the betrayal of the innocent, or a sinister and downright revolting anthology designed to convince the authorities that their twisted practice should be legalised. Its purpose to lend a faux religious gloss to a repulsive belief that the age of consent ought to be abolished. In the front cover was set out Father Finnegan's warming feather pen introduction. Why do people so vociferously defend children's right to say no, while conveniently overlooking their equivalent right to say yes? The disturbing events that I was witnessing taking place amongst those redwood trees were beginning to make their mark as the nation's worst known case of incest and inbreeding. In his congregation, brothers, sisters and visitors all slept with one another, as did aunts, uncles, fathers and daughters, the tragic result being more physically and psychologically damaged children coming into this world, and it's likely that those newly born, damaged children would themselves go on to have improper relations with one another and precipitate this life cycle of misfit. There was little chance of a care worker stumbling into the clearing, where everyone got together in a little white chapel to become part of some sick initiation ceremony in a shack of corrugated iron, wood and plastic, and a couple of broken-down caravans. The only thing to hint at normal life was the large tool shed with the Punch and Judy show inside, and a children's playground with a yellow plastic slide. This flawed family did nothing to turn the heads of the authorities. None of the laughter reached their ears, nor any of the shots fired in anger. Very few people in the nearby bustling Eternal City knew the secrets of this small clearing, swamp and green waters tucked away in a distant wood. No one realised that the raven-haired woman, the false widow in the Gothic brawl of a dress, who jumped from a quadrajet with a clutch of thin ragtag children in dirty clothes to dart into a shop for food, was in fact high priestess to an incestuous congregation. No one had any idea what was going on up there. What was going on was a family regenerating itself, a group of relatives who invited in and converted inductees, turned them on to Father Finnegan's indoctrinations, before turning in on themselves, to breed more of themselves. As the generations crossed, filled gaps, they all went wandering around, building one temporary chapel after another, a travelling horror show with a scripture written exclusively for them. Keeping the rest of the planet at arm's length, Father Finnegan drove them all around like feral cats in old vehicles and survived on the proceeds from his evangelical sermons. Over time, the family tree began to get very complicated. Many of them already have criminal records, with the younger ones calling Father Finnegan Gramps. A floorboard creaked, and the rain trickling through a thirsty plastic roof channel became an instrumental representation of how fragile the situation had become, a ridiculous microcosm of emotions growing inside of me, a whistling cyclone that insisted on pinning me to the scene, like it was a joint experiment, like it shared my vision, put fear in my eyes. In spite of the invading cockroaches, it was in the wretched corners of this room that children copulated with one another, and adults in both daylight and darkness. Adult toys lay around, and for playthings the children brought up in this environment were encouraged to mutilate the genitalia of animals they caught, whether they were cats, dogs or rabbits. They had been strung up and were hanging, petrified on lines around me. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw next through the cracks in the timbers. My attention has never before been so sharply and decisively arrested, and with such a strong, superstitious prevision of a misgiving, I saw a hood which merely had to show the shape of a face to rise up the spirit of enduring hatred within me now. Father Finnegan, making straight to the chapel door, and as would a man approaching home, he drew a key from his pocket. With the key in the lock and one hand to his head, like a man in mental perplexity, he tried twisting open the door. With the pictures on his jacket, the words of Satan signed upon his lips, he plunged away with a shudder in his blood. Once the door was free, with a wretched mixture of timidity and wantonness, he spoke in a husky, whispering voice that groped the corners of my mind. "Everything is against me. There must be something else. God bless me, this is hardly human. It's something beyond human control. Love condones fault and never ceases." With occasional gleams of moonlight between the gaps in the roof tiles, scudded across chapel like the gladness and sorrow of a man's life, he lit a dark oil lantern from a candle and slid towards the floor, his jacket breaking the flaking whitewash from the timbers. "Let it be free," he shouted to the rafters, and then more slowly and whispered, "Concealed desire is a cancer." With hope and science, I thought that his ghost might disappear, as ghosts have a habit of doing, with logic applied, as all mysterious things do when well examined. But no, the fiend was in the room that I was in. I still couldn't see his face properly. I just knew it was him by the voice and the strange objects and black insignia attached to the lapels and sleeves of his jacket as it lay around his shoulders. In any case, there's no way I could have mistaken the tattooed hand, with lantern raised, green at the fingertips, and the other reaching now for the floor of a chapel, more empty than a church, and yet alight with candles as though for a service. With my feelings gripped in a vice of intrigue and repulsion, clinging with horror to my post, I saw a man without the guts and bowels for mercy slowly emerge from the doorway on all fours and begin to crawl across the wooden boards of the chapel, with his cloak spreading out around him like great black legs. At first I couldn't believe my eyes. I thought it was some trick of the candlelight, some bizarre effect of a moon's shadow. But I kept looking, and it was no illusion. I saw his dirty bare fingers and toes grasp the grubby timbers, worn clear of nails by the shuffling soles of passing feet. And so by using every knotty hole and inequality, spitting blistering curses through pursed lips as though Christ himself were on his back, with considerable speed I watched him move across the floor, making for the old skin bag, as would a spider for a fly. Once his head and bag and cloak had all disappeared into the hole, I leaned over the window frame to try and see more, but the distance was too great to allow a proper angle of sight, and if I could have waved a hand in front of his face, he wouldn't have noticed it for all of the poison in his eyes. I felt the dread of the horrible place overpower me, but I swallowed the fear. I had to get closer. I stood right over it. I was looking right into the hole. I was witness to it, the heaving, writhing, irreligious gluttony, while he went about his work systematically. I held a candle so that I could read the symbols on his jacket, until the sperm dropped into white patches that congealed once they met with the dust of the floor. To try me further, his body shook, quivering and twisting in wild contortions, while his breath came in broken gasps with the strain. He began to groan with an anguish that no hope could soften. I leapt into the hole, and at the same time, declaring that the divine spirit within me was all-powerful, with a crashing blow, struck him with all my might around the head with the collider. In a flash the room went white, completely silent. There was nothing to see for several moments. I felt blinded. Then suddenly, from nowhere, with a howl and a whimper, a black creature ran into the room and began convulsing on the floor in front of me. At first I thought it was a dog, until I drew up the courage to move closer and look at the face and the eyes of Finnegan. A few moments more, and his charred remains were still. When I looked up through the gaps in the timbers, the night had come over a Bible black. A disrespectful silence came to the fold, a sign of wonder that drew its power and tone from wild flowers and dirty rain. It turned my heart cold as ice to see him reappear, but he knew me by then and had moved into a corner where only his own God could see his shadow. He bowed his head and began to sing with a voice of astonishing grain, tentatively stumbling his words over the music gradually, lifting the pitch to somewhere between a gravelled voice and the sweetest of croons, almost unique in its capacity to caress the very base matter of the verse, and then the edge of his words began crumbling to dust, and as they fell away from him he lost his grasp, picked up his head, opened his eyes, and glared into the green glowing crystals in his hand. He closed his eyes again and picked up the song, a rich, mature baritone voice pushed forward by the increasing tempo of the organ, a tidal wave of brutally honest words that startled me time and time again, and then drifted away into the tired, winding trees. I picked up the child, jumped out of the hole, and with what heart I had left, made my way back through the bracken.